On his deathbed, Theodore Langley, a reclusive and eccentric artist, made a shocking confession to his estranged grandson, Julian. Between labored breaths, he whispered that his celebrated art pieces were not mere sculptures, but macabre creations, fashioned from the bodies of his victims. Hidden for decades in a secret gallery beneath his sprawling estate, his masterpieces told a horrifying story of obsession and murder. With Theodore's final gasp, Julian's nightmare began. Julian Langley sat on the edge of his bed, the nurse's words from the call echoing in his mind. "Your grandfather doesn't have much time. He's asking for you. It's urgent." Theodore Langley, the once renowned artist and estranged family patriarch, was dying. Julian hadn't spoken to him in years, hadn't even thought about the man who had both haunted and fascinated his childhood. Now, he was being pulled back into his orbit. Theodore's estate was a place of strange memories, filled with lifelike sculptures that had always seemed to watch him. The artist's fame had brought admiration from the world, but within the family, his name was spoken with a mix of reverence and fear. Now, Julian was driving to a hospice, unsure of why he had answered the call at all. The room was stark and cold, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows over Theodore's gaunt form. Once a towering and commanding figure, he now looked small and frail, his skin stretched tight over brittle bones. Yet his eyes, piercing, intense, still burned with the same unsettling energy Julian remembered. "You came," Theodore rasped, his voice weak but laced with that familiar edge of authority. Julian stayed near the door, arms crossed. "What do you want?" Theodore gave a faint, almost mocking smile. "Always so direct. That's good. You'll need it for what's ahead." He motioned weakly for Julian to step closer. "I have to tell you something I've hidden for years." Julian hesitated. "If this is about the estate—" "This isn't about money," Theodore interrupted, his voice trembling with urgency. "This is about my work, my real work." Julian frowned. "Your art?" Theodore nodded, his bony hand reaching out to grab Julian's wrist. His grip, though frail, was surprisingly strong. "It's more than art. Much more. My greatest works, my masterpieces, are hidden beneath the estate. They're my secret, my triumph, and now they'll be yours." "What are you talking about?" Julian asked, a chill creeping into his voice. Theodore's eyes gleamed. "They're not just sculptures, Julian. They're preserved, perfected. They were alive once." The words hit Julian like a punch. He yanked his hand away, stepping back. "You're insane." Theodore's expression didn't falter. "Go to the gallery beneath the estate, unlock the door, look at my work, and then tell me I'm insane." Julian's stomach churned. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because someone has to know," Theodore said, his voice cracking. "When I'm gone, the truth will be yours to bear. But be warned, my art is alive in ways you can't imagine. It will haunt you, as it haunted me." The beeping of the heart monitor quickened, then slowed. Theodore's breathing grew shallow. Julian leaned in closer, his chest tight with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. "What's in the gallery? What did you do?" Theodore's lips moved, but no sound came out. His final breath escaped, leaving Julian alone with the weight of his grandfather's horrifying confession. The estate loomed in the distance, its Gothic spires cutting against the night sky. Julian parked his car, staring at the dark silhouette of the mansion. The house, once imposing, now seemed malevolent, as though it had absorbed the darkness of its master. He stepped through the heavy front doors, the familiar creak echoing in the silence. Dust hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of oil paint and varnish. Julian wandered through the house, memories of childhood visits flooding back. He remembered the statues, so lifelike they had terrified him as a boy. Their expressions, frozen in anguish or eerie serenity, had seemed too real. Now, those childhood fears felt like premonitions. Drawn to the study, Julian began searching for answers. The room was cluttered with sketches, books, and unfinished sculptures. Finally, he uncovered a leather-bound journal hidden in a desk drawer. Its pages were filled with grotesque sketches, human forms fused with plaster, resin, and metal. Notes scrawled in the margins described techniques for preserving organic matter, blending it seamlessly with inanimate materials. At the back of the journal, Julian found a crude map of the estate. An X marked a location beneath the west wing. His heart pounded. The gallery wasn't just a story, it was real. With a flashlight in hand, Julian followed the map to a hidden staircase behind a bookshelf. The air grew colder as he descended, the narrow steps creaking beneath his weight. At the bottom, a steel door waited, its surface scratched and dented. Julian hesitated, then inserted the key he had found taped to the back of the journal. The door groaned open, revealing a dark hallway lined with statues. Julian's breath caught. The sculptures were unnervingly lifelike, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved deeper into the gallery. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. Then he saw it. A sculpture so vivid, so haunting, it made his blood run cold. The face was frozen in a scream, the eyes wide with unmistakable terror. Julian stumbled back, the horrifying truth crashing over him. These weren't just sculptures. They were people. Theodore hadn't been lying. His art was alive, immortalized in agony. And now it was Julian's burden to bear. Julian stood frozen in the suffocating silence of the gallery, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The sculptures, eerily lifelike, surrounded him in the dim light. Their faces, twisted in anguish, terror, or grief, seemed to stare into his soul. Each one told a story he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The air felt thick, alive, as if the gallery itself were holding its breath. He stepped closer to a sculpture, compelled to examine it. The details were too perfect. Every wrinkle, pore, and vein was rendered with horrifying accuracy. The eyes, cloudy and lifeless, seemed to follow him. Julian reached out, his fingers brushing the cold surface of the figure's arm. It didn't feel like stone. It felt like skin. He recoiled, nausea twisting his stomach. "No," he whispered. "This can't be real." But the evidence was everywhere. These weren't sculptures. They were people. People his grandfather had transformed and preserved like grotesque trophies. The realization sent a wave of nausea over him, but he forced himself to stay. He needed answers. Julian turned his attention to the journal in his hand. Theodore's notes detailed the process with horrifying precision. Chemicals, resin, and surgical techniques. "Art is the immortalization of beauty," one passage read. "To capture humanity, one must preserve it at its peak. My work defies decay and death." As he ventured deeper, Julian began to notice patterns. The figures weren't random. They were posed, staged to tell a story. A man crouched with his hands over his face radiated despair. A woman outstretched her arms as if trying to escape. Julian's breath hitched at the sight of a young girl, her expression frozen in fear. Her small hand reached for something unseen, her wide eyes locked in silent terror. The air grew colder. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the gallery. Julian turned sharply, but nothing was there. His flashlight beam caught a metal object on the floor. He bent to pick it up, a rusted key, identical to the one that had opened the gallery door. "What else did you hide, old man?" Julian muttered, his voice unsteady. Backing toward the door, his flashlight swept the room one last time. That's when he saw it. A figure at the far end of the gallery, partially hidden by shadows. Unlike the others, it wasn't still. It leaned forward, its head tilted as if listening. The flashlight slipped from Julian's hand, clattering to the floor. He scrambled to pick it up, his breaths shallow. When he aimed the light back, the figure was gone. "Get a grip," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You're imagining things." The feeling didn't leave. Julian bolted for the staircase, not stopping until he was back in the study. Slamming the secret door shut, he leaned against it, chest heaving. The journal fell from his hand onto the desk with a dull thud. The air here was lighter, but his mind wasn't. What had Theodore done, and what had Julian seen? He opened the journal again, flipping through trembling hands. One passage stood out. "The gallery is only the beginning. Beneath it lies my true masterpiece, the culmination of years of work. Only the worthy may unlock its secrets." Julian's pulse quickened. Beneath the gallery? He hadn't seen any other passage. Was there more? He glanced at the rusted key. It had to lead somewhere. But did he want to know? Theodore's notes were cryptic, filled with symbols and phrases he couldn't understand. But one sketch caught his eye, a detailed drawing of the gallery with the staircase at its far end. Below the sketch was a single word: Requiem. The word sent a chill through him. What was Theodore's requiem, and why had he hidden it? Julian knew he should leave, call the authorities and let them handle it. But curiosity gripped him. The memory of the figure at the gallery's edge haunted him. Could it have been a trick of the light? His mind playing games? Or had Theodore's warning been real? Was the art alive in ways Julian couldn't yet understand? Even the house itself seemed to hum with tension, its silence oppressive. It was as though the mansion had absorbed the darkness Theodore had spent a lifetime creating. Every creak of the wooden floors beneath Julian's feet sounded louder now, each noise resonating like an unspoken warning. Julian paced the study, his thoughts racing. He glanced again at the rusted key, its edges worn with time. His grandfather's final words echoed once more. "My art is alive in ways you can't imagine. It will haunt you." He stared at the journal one last time. A single word scrawled in Theodore's messy handwriting. Legacy. Julian's grip tightened on the key. Whatever lay beneath the gallery, he had to find it. Not just for answers, but for closure, for an end to the darkness that plagued his family. With a deep breath, he made his decision. He would return to the gallery, find the staircase, and uncover the truth. As he descended once more, the thought lingered. Some doors are better left unopened. Julian descended the staircase, the rusted key clutched tightly in his hand. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence pressed against his ears like a tangible force. His flashlight beam wavered over the stone walls, their surface slick with condensation. This passage wasn't part of the gallery. It was older, rougher, carved from the earth itself. He couldn't turn back now. At the bottom of the stairs, Julian found another door, massive and made of iron. Symbols he didn't recognize were etched into its surface, their patterns both mesmerizing and unsettling. A circular keyhole sat at the center. With trembling hands, Julian inserted the rusted key. For a moment he hesitated, his grandfather's words echoing. Only the worthy may unlock its secrets. With a deep breath, he turned the key. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous space beyond. The room was vast, its ceiling swallowed by darkness. His flashlight barely illuminated the edges, but what little he could see made his stomach churn. Rows upon rows of figures stood motionless, their faces frozen in torment and despair. These weren't sculptures. They were far worse. The air was thick with the metallic tang of chemicals, and the faint hum of an unseen machine vibrated through the chamber. Julian moved deeper, realizing these figures were different from the ones above. They weren't posed or staged. They seemed frozen mid-movement, as though fleeing something unspeakable. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows. At the far end of the room, a large structure loomed. It resembled an altar, its surface cluttered with tools, scalpels, syringes, and jars of strange substances. A massive, unfinished figure lay sprawled across it, partially encased in resin. Its grotesque size and unnatural form made Julian's skin crawl. Beside the tools rested a journal bound in black leather. Unlike the one he'd found earlier, this bore no title. Julian hesitated, but his hands moved of their own accord, flipping to the first page. The writing was Theodore's. The opening lines sent a chill down Julian's spine. "The Requiem is my greatest work. It is not merely art, it is a gateway. Through it, life and death will blur, and humanity will understand immortality." Julian slammed the journal shut, his heart pounding. A gateway? What had Theodore done? He glanced at the unfinished figure on the altar, its resin-coated limbs seeming to shimmer in the light. He wanted to leave, but morbid curiosity held him in place. The faint hum grew louder. Wires and tubes snaked along the chamber walls, converging at a generator in the corner. Its rhythm was almost organic. Julian followed the wires, realizing they connected to the altar, and to the figure resting atop it. A sudden noise shattered the silence. It was faint but unmistakable. A low, guttural exhale, like the first breath of something that had been asleep too long. Julian froze. The sound came again, louder, from the altar. "No," he whispered, stepping back. "This isn't happening." The unfinished figure twitched. Resin-coated limbs jerked unnaturally, and the air grew heavy, charged with static. Julian's flashlight trembled as he watched the thing on the altar move. Its head tilted slowly, resin cracking. Fragmented features locked onto Julian. Its eyes weren't human, but they saw him. In that moment, Julian knew he'd made a terrible mistake. The hum of the generator grew deafening. Wires glowed with an eerie light as the figure's movements became fluid, deliberate, like it was waking from a restless sleep. Julian's heart pounded as the thing began to rise. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He raised the flashlight as if it could protect him. The figure lurched forward, its limbs bending impossibly. Resin cracked and fell, revealing a surface that shimmered like polished stone. Julian stumbled, nearly dropping the flashlight. As the figure took unsteady steps, Julian turned and ran. He sprinted toward the staircase, the sound of shattering resin and uneven footsteps echoing behind him. The adrenaline pumping through his veins drowned out everything but his need to escape. Reaching the stairs, he scrambled up, lungs burning. He didn't look back. The only thing that mattered was escape. When he finally reached the study, Julian slammed the hidden door shut and pressed his weight against it, gasping for air. His heart thundered in his chest. For a moment, silence returned, broken only by his ragged breathing. Then, faintly, he heard it, the sound of scratching at the door. Julian's mind raced as he stared at the door. It was impossible. Whatever was down there couldn't follow him, couldn't leave that cursed space. But the faint, deliberate scratching continued, sending a shiver through him. His flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the study into darkness. He backed away from the door, his chest heaving. His fingers fumbled to find the journal, desperate to understand what his grandfather had unleashed. As he flipped through its pages, his breath caught on one passage. "The Requiem is incomplete without its host. The chosen must bear the burden for the art to reach its final form." The chosen. Julian's stomach twisted. Theodore's notes were vague, cryptic, but the implication was clear. The Requiem wasn't just a creation. It needed something, or someone, to fully awaken. A sudden thud against the hidden door jolted him. The scratching had stopped, replaced by something heavier, more forceful. Julian stumbled back, his mind screaming at him to run, to leave the house and never return. But his legs refused to move. He was frozen, trapped between fear and the sickening pull of curiosity. Then, through the oppressive silence, came a voice, a whisper that seemed to rise from the very walls. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Julian. The sound of his name made his blood run cold. The voice wasn't his grandfather's. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. The whisper of his name hung in the air like a cold wind, sending shivers down Julian's spine. He staggered back, his breathing uneven, eyes locked on the door. The scratching had stopped, replaced by silence so oppressive it was deafening. And yet, the word lingered. Julian. It hadn't been his grandfather's voice, nor anything human. It was distorted, warped, a sound that crawled under his skin. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." The journal in his hands was proof of the madness. His grandfather's requiem had begun to stir, and its force was now clawing at the edges of reality. Shadows thickened, pressing inward as if alive. He flipped through the journal's pages, the words blurring in his panic. "The requiem transcends art," one passage read. "It is a vessel for eternity, a bridge between life and the infinite. But every masterpiece requires sacrifice." The word sacrifice was underlined. Julian's chest tightened. Was that what his grandfather meant by the chosen? Did the requiem require someone to complete its transformation? A loud bang against the door jolted him. This time the noise wasn't faint. It was forceful, deliberate. The handle rattled violently. Julian froze, his breath caught in his throat. Then, slowly, the door began to creak open. The crack widened, and Julian caught a glimpse of movement. A hand, a twisted, resin-coated hand, gripped the edge of the doorframe. His flashlight flickered, the beam shaking as it landed on the figure emerging from the shadows. It was the requiem. No longer bound to the altar, the unfinished figure stepped into the study, its fragmented features twisted into something almost human. Julian's legs refused to move as the creature took another step. Its obsidian-like surface gleamed, cracks forming across its body with each motion. Its head tilted as if studying him. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with overlapping voices. Julian clutched his head, the sound unbearable, his knees buckling beneath him. "Why?" he gasped. "Why me?" The creature paused, its gaze locked on him. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, it answered, "You are the bloodline. You are the key." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. Theodore had chosen him, prepared him for this. The requiem wasn't just art, it was a legacy, one that required its creator's lineage to fulfill its purpose. "No," Julian whispered, "I won't be a part of this." He pushed himself to his feet, adrenaline surging. The creature tilted its head, almost amused before lunging forward. Julian's gaze darted to the desk where the journal's pages lay scattered. Among them was the sketch of the gallery, the staircase, the altar, and a hidden passage labeled Exit. He grabbed the map and bolted for the door. The requiem moved faster now, its jagged limbs scraping against the floor. Julian barely dodged as one of its arms lashed out, splintering the desk. He stumbled into the hallway, not daring to look back. The whispers followed him, louder, more desperate, as if the house itself were alive. Julian sprinted through the corridors, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. His only thought was the passage beneath the altar. If he could reach it, maybe he could escape. The staircase loomed ahead, the hidden door to the gallery still ajar. Julian's lungs burned as he descended. The gallery was just as he had left it, the lifelike sculptures standing in silent torment. But now, their eyes seemed to follow him. He reached the altar, his hands fumbling over its resin-coated surface. The map had shown a hidden panel, a mechanism to open the way. "Come on," he muttered, panic rising. "Come on." Behind him, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. The requiem was there, its presence suffocating. His fingers found the panel, a latch beneath the altar's edge. He pulled, and with a groan of stone against stone, a hidden door slid open. Without hesitation, Julian climbed inside. The door slid shut behind him, sealing him in darkness. The roar of the whispers faded, replaced by silence so complete it was almost worse. He sat there, heart pounding, the map clenched in his hand. The Requiem was still out there, but for now he was alive. But the passage was no refuge. As Julian's flashlight illuminated the narrow walls, he realized they were covered in carvings, intricate, grotesque depictions of figures much like the ones above. These weren't random etchings. They told a story, one of creation and destruction, of sacrifice and rebirth. It was the story of the Requiem. The carvings pulsed under the beam of the flashlight, almost alive. Julian shivered, moving deeper into the tunnel. The air was colder here, thinner. His footsteps echoed, each sound amplified into something unnatural. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. At the end of the passage, Julian found another door. This one was smaller, made of aged wood, its surface engraved with the same symbols he'd seen on the iron door above. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Whatever lay beyond, he knew it would bring him closer to the truth, or to his end. Taking a deep breath, Julian pushed the door open. Julian stepped through the aged wooden door, his flashlight's weak beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. The air was heavier, colder, and carried a metallic tang that clung to his tongue. The walls of the passage were no longer rough stone, but smooth and polished, covered with intricate carvings that seemed to shift under his gaze. The etched figures twisted and contorted, their faces locked in anguish. They were watching him. Of that he was certain. His breath quickened as he gripped the flashlight tighter. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint echo of his footsteps and his own uneven breathing. The weight of the passage bore down on him, making every step feel heavier. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to abandon this nightmare, but the pull of the unknown drew him forward. At the end of the passage stood a door, darker than the one before. Its surface was engraved with the same cryptic symbols he'd seen in Theodore's journal. Julian hesitated, his hand trembling as it hovered over the handle. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to stop, to flee while he still could. But the pull of the Requiem, the need to understand, was too strong. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. What lay beyond was unlike anything he had seen before. The room was enormous, a cavernous expanse lit by an eerie glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Towering stone columns lined the walls, each one adorned with grotesque carvings of figures locked in eternal struggle. At the center of the room was a circular platform, bathed in an otherworldly light that pulsed faintly. Above the platform hung the Requiem, its form no longer incomplete. It writhed and shimmered like a living entity, its surface glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Julian's knees nearly buckled as the whispers returned, louder and more invasive than ever. They echoed through the cavern, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. Bloodline. You are the key. The work must be completed. He stumbled toward the platform, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers weren't just sounds. They were voices, the echoes of countless souls trapped within the Requiem. Julian realized with growing horror that the Requiem wasn't merely a creation. It was alive, a vessel for something far greater and far darker than he could comprehend. And it wanted him. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a single, resonant voice that seemed to come from the Requiem itself. Julian, it said, the sound reverberating through the cavern like a thunderclap. You are the key. The bloodline completes the circle. Julian shook his head violently, his body trembling. I'm not a part of this, he shouted, his voice breaking. I won't let you take me. The Requiem pulsed again, the light around it intensifying. The cavern seemed to contract, the air thickening as the walls pressed inward. The carvings on the columns began to move, their grotesque forms breaking free from the stone. Figures of resin and darkness emerged, their jagged limbs reaching for him with agonizing slowness. Julian staggered back, his flashlight flickering as the room closed in around him. Desperate, his eyes darted around the cavern, searching for anything that could help him. Near the base of the platform he spotted a pedestal. Atop it rested a small, ornate dagger, its blade glinting faintly in the pale light. The whispers rose to a deafening roar as Julian lunged for the dagger, his hand closing around its hilt. The Requiem's voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath him. "Your blood will complete the work," it thundered. Julian turned to face the platform, the dagger trembling in his grip. "Not mine," he growled through clenched teeth. With all his strength he drove the blade into the base of the platform. The effect was immediate. The light around the Requiem flickered, its form destabilizing as cracks spiderwebbed across its surface. The carvings froze mid-motion, their grotesque figures suspended in place as an ear-splitting scream tore through the cavern. The Requiem collapsed in on itself, its light extinguished in an instant. The cavern plunged into darkness, the oppressive weight lifting as silence returned. Julian lay still, his breaths shallow and uneven. His fingers still gripped the dagger, the blade slick with his sweat. When he finally forced himself to stand, he saw the platform was gone. The Requiem had been reduced to fragments of stone scattered across the floor, but Julian knew it wasn't truly over. The Requiem's legacy, its curse, would linger, and as the last remaining bloodline, it was up to him to ensure it ended here. He clutched the map tightly, his only guide in the labyrinthine passage ahead. The whispers were gone, but their echoes still haunted him. With a deep breath he stepped into the darkness once more, determined to finish what Theodore had started. The tunnel stretched endlessly before Julian, its walls narrowing and pressing in on him. His flashlight flickered weakly, barely illuminating the ground beneath his feet. Every step felt heavier, his body weighed down by exhaustion and the echoes of the Requiem's destruction. He clutched the map tightly, his fingers trembling. The silence was unnatural, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for him to take the final step into the unknown. The carvings on the walls grew more grotesque, their twisted faces etched with torment. Julian felt their eyes following him. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, but the darkness revealed nothing. His breath quickened as he muttered under his breath, "This has to end." The passage sloped downward, the air growing colder and thinner. His legs shook as he descended, his lungs burning. The map in his hand offered little guidance, its symbols becoming harder to interpret. When his flashlight illuminated another door, he froze. This one was massive, its black stone surface glowing faintly with red symbols. A pulsing energy radiated from it, making his skin crawl. Julian's heart pounded as he stepped closer. "This is it," he whispered. His hand hovered over the handle, the malevolent force behind the door making every fiber of his being scream to turn back. But he couldn't stop now. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. A blinding light engulfed him. When it faded, Julian found himself in a circular chamber. The walls were covered in carvings depicting scenes of creation and destruction, life and death intertwined. At the center stood an altar, its surface slick with a dark, viscous liquid that glimmered faintly. Above the altar hung the Requiem. It was alive, its smooth surface glowing faintly as it pulsed in sync with his heartbeat. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the chamber. Bloodline. Complete the circle. The legacy must endure. Julian clutched his head, the voices overwhelming him. He dropped the map and staggered back, his breaths shallow. The Requiem wasn't just a creation, it was a gateway, a vessel for something far greater. And it wanted him. "No!" Julian screamed. "I won't let you take me." The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonant voice. "You have no choice, Julian," it said. "The bloodline must endure. The Requiem must live." The altar glowed brighter, the dark liquid rippling as if alive. Julian staggered toward a second pedestal near the altar, where an ancient tome rested. Its pages glowed faintly, the text written in a language he didn't understand. But the symbols were familiar. They matched the ones Theodore had sketched. One phrase burned into his mind. To sever the requiem, the bloodline must bleed. His chest tightened. He understood now. The requiem's power was tied to Theodore's lineage. To destroy it, the bloodline had to end. Tears welled in his eyes as he gripped the dagger he had taken earlier. The requiem pulsed brighter, its whispers pleading. Don't. You are the key. This ends now, Julian whispered. I won't let it take anyone else. The whispers screamed in protest, growing louder as Julian raised the blade to his chest. The entire chamber trembled, the carvings on the walls shattering as the requiem writhed. Its glow intensified, pulsing faster as if it sensed what he was about to do. Julian's mind raced with memories of his grandfather's warnings, of the lives claimed by the requiem. He saw their faces in his mind, the frozen figures, the tormented eyes etched into the walls, and he knew there was no other way. His breath hitched as he whispered, I'm sorry, and drove the blade into his chest. The effect was immediate. The requiem let out a deafening roar, its form destabilizing as cracks spread across its surface. The altar split apart, the liquid spilling and evaporating into mist. The carvings crumbled, the walls collapsing inward as the chamber was consumed by chaos. Julian fell to his knees, the dagger still clutched in his hand as the world around him dissolved into darkness. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, faintly, Julian felt the oppressive weight lift. The whispers were gone, replaced by an all-encompassing void. He closed his eyes, a strange sense of peace washing over him. The requiem was no more. Its legacy had ended with him, and the curse that had haunted his family for generations was finally broken. Julian's body fell still, his final breath escaping into the void. The chamber continued to collapse, the remnants of the requiem disintegrating into dust. As the last fragment crumbled, the darkness consumed everything, leaving nothing behind. But in the void where silence reigned, a faint ember of light flickered where the requiem had once stood. Though diminished, its energy lingered, fragile yet persistent, as if waiting for another hand to discover its dormant potential. Some legacies, it seemed, refused to stay buried.